how's it going out there, everybody? Gun Psychiatrist back with part 3 of the Hydrographics and Painting Training Death by PowerPoint. So if you missed part 1 I covered a lot of the troubleshooting when it comes down to painting, what you're going to see on your substrates, things like that. If you missed that part, there was a lot of critical information in it, even though it was very long. The content that was in there is really needed for you to build on your knowledge so you can recognize problems as they may arise in your shop when painting things in preparation for hydrographics. Part 2 was also talked more about the painting aspects. I was able to put some videos in there of me actually doing some paints in my old shop, and I think I gave a really good background of all the things that you need to know when you're painting, and especially with different types of paints and all that fun stuff. So there's a lot of good information on that. It wasn't so boring because we did have a mixture of some cool little paint videos in there. So it's not all death by PowerPoint. I highly recommend you check it out. But now you've come to part 3, where we're going to talk about dipping. And probably some of this audience, I have a feeling, are going to be Sonoran Desert Institute students that got this dip kit in the mail with the probably most terrible instructions that have left them with more questions than answers out of the class. And don't feel bad about it. This happens to everybody when they're dipping, because where the training lacked, and I'm not blaming the school in any way, their books were just pretty much copied straight from the dip kit training. But the hardest thing with hydrographics is trying to understand what you're doing wrong. And when you don't understand what you're doing wrong, you're never going to get it right. And trust me, this was one of my biggest frustrations when I first tried to pierce the veil into the hydrographics industry, is I always had problems. Why can't I get this right? And let me tell you, it's a pain. But over time, you begin to learn the process, and there's a lot of tips and tricks in there that I want to share with you today that might help you along the way of reading your prints for what they're telling you that you're doing wrong, so you can not repeat the problem. Hydrographics industry is also a really cutthroat industry. I probably would never go back into it, but people are still interested in it, and people make money from doing it. It's just a dime a dozen. It's like Kydex holsters. Everybody out there does them, and some people get their hands on some basic stuff to do hydrographics with, and they want to enter into the industry, and it creates a lot of issues. So you got to be careful when going on the forums, because a lot of the forums, there's going to be people that can tell you, oh, you can dip Cerakote. You cannot use Cerakote as a base coat when you're doing hydrographics. Why? The people that say they've claimed to do that successfully, what they've done is they've matched Cerakote colors with the urethane paint. The ink has to bond to urethane. Look, it's a jungle, and you got to really be careful with some of the advice you get out there. I'm pretty much a straight shooter. I'm going to tell you the nit and grit of it all. Some people can agree, some people can disagree. You guys can tear me up. I don't care. But I'm just going to give you, from my perspective, the training that I'm using is training that I'm using to train successors of my business, or my business that I sold. And I wouldn't want to steer them wrong, so you can be guaranteed I'm not going to steer you wrong. And of course, I don't have all the answers. I've only been doing it for about 4 years, 5 years, and it just, hey, you get better every day, and you learn as you get skilled at something, and every day is a learning experience. So let's just keep that attitude. I don't know if this was covered in SDI or not, but I'm going to go ahead and cover it again, because some people watching this video might not understand what the hydrographics process is. The process uses a polyvinyl alcohol film that contains complex patterns printed in the ink. The film dissolves in the water and leaves the ink on the surface. In the typical process, the item is first coated with a primer or an adhesion promoter. After the primer is dry, a base coat paint is applied, which controls the hue of the pattern. Many hydrographic films are transparent, which means you can achieve unique designs by customizing the base coat colors. But you have to be careful. Some designs are licensed and have to use specific colors, because you can get yourself into a lot of hot water, especially your suppliers. For example, wood grain films often utilize a brown base coat, and many camouflage patterns use required base coat color to maintain the integrity of the pattern. After the base coat is applied, the item is ready for decorating. The film is activated with an activator. The item is then dipped into the water, and the ink wraps around it. Excessive PVA residue which is the polyvinyl alcohol. It's all the slimy stuff left after the activation and dipping process, is then washed off. The part is dried, and a clear top coat is applied to protect it. The Hydrographics tank that I had was a PA Hydrographics tank. It was a 50 amp, 220 volt single phase tank. The dipping area was approximately 7.5 feet by 1 meter wide. Whatever tank you're using, it's best to clean it after each use and keep it running in between dips, because the running of the water, number one, is going to help evaporate the activator, clean any micro little pigments of film, keep them into the filtration system that the water runs into, and of course it's going to help keep your tank up to temperature. Now, if you're not going to be doing any dipping that day, there's no need to run the tank, but just know after a couple dips, if that stagnant water sits for a few days, it's going to start to stink and you're going to want to change it. On average, and you're going to get mixed hits with the industry on this, and some people will change their water once every 6 months. I don't know how they dip in that shit. Drain and scrub the tank every 1 to 2 months, depending on its usage. It's going to start getting green. It's going to get nasty. And if you have excess activator in there that's not evaporating off, it's going to cause you problems with your film. I found that about once a month, especially down in Florida, I would clean my tank. I would just drain it, get all the nasty shit out, scrub it down, and keep it clean. Clean's good, whatever. I wasn't paying for the water bill, so it was what it was. Blue filter strips are 10 inches by 4 feet. And I recommend using 2 of them. And all the blue filter material is you can get it. It's paint booth material. It's like white on one side and blue on the other. It's just foam. It has sticky stuff on it. And it's great to use to catch film and all that stuff. One thing I would recommend, whatever tank you're using, whether it's a fiberglass or a stainless steel tank, do not use bleach in the water. Some people do that. Bleach is corrosive. It's stupid to use. It's going to ruin your clothes and your uniforms. Do not use it in the water to help control bacteria and stuff. Just drain your damn tank. 200-300 gallons of water every month is not going to kill you. You use more than that at the house, and the water bill ain't that terrible. So the wash station was a self-built one. It was a 30 amp, 220 volt single phase system. The wash area was approximately 4 feet by 8 feet. I recommend having about the same wash area as what's going to be the size of your tank. There's no filtration necessary in a wash station, although you can. It's best to keep the shower heads clean, because if you do have a filtration system in it, that will help skim out some of the stuff that is going to clog the shower heads. But it's best to scrub the holding tank and the wash basin quarterly, and probably change the water in the tank. If you have a recirculation system like I built, it's best to probably do that weekly. And you might even do it daily, depending on how frequent you're washing the stuff out of there, because the one thing it's going to tend to do is foam. And unless you can find some like spa treatment to keep the foam down, I just don't prefer getting chemicals and stuff on that, because I think it could compromise the integrity of the ink. So I just choose to run straight water, and it's going to smell like shit and like dead fish. So just clean it out as necessary. Do not use chemicals again or bleach in your water. I can say that enough, because it's corrosive. Tank settings. And these are going to apply to anybody with a tank, whether that is a plastic tote from Walmart or if it is a professional grade tank. Your PID or water temperature needs to be set between 91 and 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Water level, the main tank should be at the top of the heat tank, because there's going to be a heat tank. If you're using a professional series tank, you're going to have a chamber that has your heaters in it. So when I'm talking about the water level of the main tank, that is the main dipping area. And it should be to where it's not running over once you turn the pump off and everything settles. It should not be running over continually into the heat tank. It's going to get to a point to where it's going to level out, and the water level in the heat tank should be 1 inch below that of the main tank. So basically you're going to have a little ramp that it slides down to help deflect the water onto the filtration pads, and you want to have it just right to the top of that ramp, maybe a little bit lower. Honestly, with the heat, it's going to evaporate faster. It's going to keep your shop humid, so you can let it go a little low, but you just don't want to let it get too low to where you start sucking air with your pump when it's on, because that can happen. When the tank foams or cavitates, water must be added. So you're going to hear it to a point to where the evaporation of continually running that tank, it's going to evaporate the water out of it, and your pump's going to start foaming the freaking main tank. It's going to turn into a disaster. So you have to add water when that happens to control that. And you'll hear the pump change tones and all that fun stuff, and you'll know it's time to add water. It's best not to let that pump run dry because it can get it hot and ruin the pump. For your activator gun, your pneumatic gun settings, again, I'm using one of the DeVilbiss FLG4 paint clear coat guns for an activator. Why? Because it atomizes. Activation, proper activation, all relies on proper atomization. Your line PSI from your regulator should be set at 58 pounds per square inch. You must have a moisture trap. So I try to get one of those that has a regulator and moisture trap on it. Okay? And then below that moisture trap, I would have a drain to where you could drain excess water out of your line because it's a low point. So I usually would incorporate a low point, bounce the regulator off, and then that would feed the activator gun that goes to the tank. So remember, 58 PSI on that. Must have a moisture trap for sure. The gun regulator is set about to 10 to 14 PSI. And the gun must use a moisture trap adapter on the gun. Do not use a desiccant filter. The results will be disastrous. And you cannot precisely control the air flow into that. So 58 PSI at the regulator, 10 to 14 PSI on the line. The reason that is, because when you set up your activator gun, you need to set it up to where you get good atomization, you don't get splotches or big droplets, but at the same time, you also need to have it to where it does not, from the height that you're going to activate at, that it does not ripple the water too much to where it could break up the pattern when you're activating. So it just should barely be showing pressure on the water. And you'll see the water wave just kind of like this. And it should just barely be just disturbing the surface of the water. The activator gun set up for the FLG4. Activator gun is usually set up 3 turns out, full fan, no exceptions. Of course, if I was there, I would be showing you the specific procedure for setting up the activator gun. I would usually run it out to the max and find out how many turns that is and then run it in to where it's 3 turns out. Many videos, of course, exist online pertaining to activator gun setup. I would use the TWN recommended settings, which I just read to you, that are slightly modified for our specific equipment. Not everything's going to be, because TWN's using a $600 DeVilbiss activator gun that throws a fan pattern like 5 feet. I mean, it's insane because it atomizes insane. If you want to spend the $600 on that paint gun, I would highly recommend it because the results that you're going to get from it with your dips are going to be reflected by the amount of hair you retain on your head from not having to re-dip everything all the time. So I would run that DeVilbiss gun that TWN recommends, but not everybody has that $600 budget. The FLG4 from DeVilbiss is a pretty dang good gun, and it'll get the job done. Once the parts have been cured from painting, it's time to prep them for dipping. This is where using masking tape comes into play, and you want to use masking tape and go along all edges of the part that you're going to be dipping. Tape the holes and other areas that could cause a blowout or water contamination. When you get water onto a part that's going to be dipped as it's being dipped, or you get a drip because water moves, water does all sorts of things. And when you read your parts, you need to read your parts like you're standing under the tank and the part is coming down and you're looking up at it as it's coming down. Because you might have to change certain angles while you're dipping, and that could cause water to get on the part sometimes just because it creeps around the back, or you didn't have it taped right and water escaped back through. And what's going to happen is if water gets on the part that's going to be dipped on the surface in between the paint and the ink, it's not going to print. And you're going to be left with a spot there that you really can't airbrush out. So you need to learn how to read your parts. And sometimes I have to look at it like this and say, okay, if I'm water, what's the best way I'm going to run on this part? Over time, you'll start to get good, and you can actually look down at it and see, okay, everything's going to be in reverse, but all right, I'm seeing how everything's starting to flow on here. So sometimes just looking up at this object, if you're looking up at this object, you can see that water is going to tend to want to flow up through these maybe a little bit quicker than it's going to want to flow out through those, or maybe a little bit slower. A lot of this comes in with experience, but you can start to read the part and see how everything's going to go. So once you mask off the entire part, now for like a bottle like this, we're going to do what's called a roll dip, where we would, for like, say this was a Yeti cup, we would have a piece of tape around the base of it, and we would hold onto that piece of tape, and then we would have a cup in the top to help keep water from just rushing in, and usually one of the largest solo cups you can get are about best for that, because we're going to use that cup to help roll it while it's in there. And what we would do is we would come in at an angle and let it barely float on the water and do a nice smooth roll into the film. And we're going to get one seam across the back. And usually if you're good enough, it's usually luck, but sometimes you can get the prints to match up perfectly and you won't even see a seam. Even the pros have trouble doing that, but sometimes it can work, sometimes it won't. It's also fair to note that some parts can use jigs to dip the parts. So like if you have 15 scope rings you need to dip all in the same pattern, you can make a jig and line them all up on a jig, run one long piece of film and dip them all at once. That way, boom, the more dipping that you can do in one time, the better and the faster turnaround you're going to get. And why I say this is usually with one dip, it's about a 5-minute turnaround for me, because number one, I dip the part. Number two, I got to walk it over the wash tank, which is fairly close, but you don't want it too close to where it sprays water onto your tank. Number three, I got to go back and clean all that film out of the tank and let the tank run and clear itself to get the activator out. Number four, I got to shut it off and let it settle. And number five, I have to get the film back on it, activate, wait a minute, all that fun stuff. So it's about a 5-minute turnaround when I get busy. And that's pretty quick, but that comes with time and experience. Jigs can be made from any material such as wood, plastic, and metal. The imagination's the limit. For magnetic objects, magnets can be used. So if you're using ferromagnetic materials, you can use magnets on poles or on metal or whatever you need. You can affix magnets to things to make dipping jigs for parts. That way you minimize the contact with your hands. So for the magnetic objects, magnets can be used for dipping single or multiple parts. Jigs really save time and money, so you can dip multiple parts at once. Masking tape can be used over Hydrographics, but you must stick it to your shirt first to take some of the tack out. So usually in a situation that would warrant for you to have to stick the masking tape on your shirt to take the tack out of it would be when you do what's known as a double dip. Sometimes objects are too big to dip all in one shot. They may not fit in your tank, so you got to dip half of it and then dip the other half. When that happens, sometimes you're going to have to mask over the previous existing Hydrographics. So you can either find a masking tape with a very extremely low tack, or you can either apply it to your shirt and use some of the lint on your shirt to take some of the tack out. That way you have less of a chance of actually ripping up some of the ink off the previously printed part. And that allows you to print the part again and, of course, keep any ink from running on top of the other ink that's there before, because that can make a real mess too. Masking tapes come in different tacks or adhesion levels. Typically, the tan tape that you find at the store is high tack. It's very sticky and can pull up paint and Hydrographics. Blue, aka painter's tape, is mostly medium tack, won't pull up properly applied paint. And of course, there's some special grades of blues for some painter tapes that can be special ordered in low tack. Or stick a piece of cotton shirts to remove some of the tack from it as well. Either or works, just depends on what your budget's looking like. Tape stock, I would, and this doesn't really apply to anybody out there, but this might be helpful information. I would advise keeping a log of the following, or just, when I say a log, that means a whole roll, not a roll, but a whole log of tape. So 10 rolls of the following. I would keep probably some tan high tack, 1.88 inch, some medium tack blue, 1.88 inch, some medium tack 1 inch, some medium tack 0.5 inch, some green 1/4 inch pinstripe tape, and then some 3M vinyl pinstripe tape at 1/4 inch size as well. And the green pinstripe tape's good for going around really small areas, or doing some really straight lines or maybe curved lines. it's still masking tape, and of course the blue vinyl 3M tape that's a really dark blue, that you can make a really elaborate curves and stuff like that. So say you're going to do like a racing stripe or something, you can hand lay that out with the blue stripe tape from 3M, and it really gives some amazing results. So just keep that in mind. When prepping parts, wear a new clean pair of nitrile gloves all the time to avoid any grease or oil contamination while taping or scratching the part. Get some cheap towels from the dollar store and only use them for taping parts on. So I usually cut my film on a stainless steel workbench that has the dimensions of my tank taped out on them. But when I'm not using that because of dust and all that other stuff, what I'll do is I'll throw some just cheap dollar store towels over the top, and I will tape on those surfaces. If you contaminate a part with grease or oil, immediately clean and wipe it out with wipeout cleaner and clean it with a microfiber cloth. Of course, I would probably do that before dipping anyways if you've been, touching the parts and stuff like that. If you happen to scratch a part, don't dip it, scuff the area and repaint it. Take your time. Avoid getting any moisture on parts. If water gets on a painted surface and you dip the part, it will not print. Case in point for situations like this is your wash station within the proximity of your dipping area. If you have an open face on your wash station and it's misting water out of there, that water can carry through the air and land on the parts that you're preparing for hydrographics. If that happens and they're wet and you go to dip it, you're going to get spots all over it and it's not going to print to the paint. So be cautious about what you're spraying in your shop, especially activator as well. If you don't have good ventilation in your shop where your tank is located, that activator can land on parts and also cause problems too. Over time, the D-cup holders for the activator will begin to leak. And yes, I use D-cups on that. It makes activator changes really simple, but because of the composition of the activator, it will cause the D-cups to leak. So what I always do is I pull the spray gun up off and hold it straight down like I'm going to apply activator, but don't squeeze. And I'll observe where the D-cup sits onto the retaining mount on the top of the spray gun. And if I notice any leaks or drips, I will actually replace the D-cup before I go to spraying any film and I got activated film on the water. The reason that is because if you get drops of activator on your film, it's going to blow out the print and could cause over-activation on your part that you're actually dipping if you hit that specific spot. The worst thing you can have is drops of activator falling on your film while you're activating. And that can happen if you use the D-cups. When using just a regular paint cup that sits on top of the gun, that can also be dangerous because the seals in that thing can start to leak over time. So I always just like to use the D-cups because they give a good positive seal all the time. But just know you might have to replace them from time to time. TWN films use specific activator for each film. So you can download an app from TWN for fast reference on activator. Over time, you'll start to learn these. But they have a 3502 and an NJM 2010 activator. And each film uses its own specific activator. Some people just use Hydrographics, some people use whatever, but I always stuck with the specific activator meant for that film. Now, thing is, when you're using those D-cups, it can allow you to identify what activator goes in what, where it goes, and all that fun stuff. So I like to use that. It's just a helpful, quick changeover, no mess, no having to pour more, it really works out smooth using the D-cup system with activator. Ensure the film cutting table is free of grease, oil, water, or activator. I always had a rule: no drinks or anything wet on the film cutting table. No exceptions, no beer, no nothing. Do not store food or drink on the film table. And trust me, this is a good rule to exercise discipline on. I'm telling you. Use a sharp razor blade to cut the film. Disposable razor blades or an X-Acto knife kit from Harbor Freight are an inexpensive option. When you do cut the film, the best way to do it is to lay it out, and you want to have little clamps you can make up that you can hold the film. You don't necessarily always need this, but instead of taping the film and doing all that fancy stuff, I make the cut and then just cut the ends every inch or so. Just make a little cut at 45 degrees. Which will allow the film to roll into itself and not blow out or anything like that. I have a pre-dipping checklist that I like to go through mentally, and it probably helps to post this somewhere so you can make your own pre-dip checklist and post it in front so you can run through it and get it right every single time. Film table is clean. So that's the table that you're cutting the film on. It's clean, free of dust or debris. All the parts are taped and ready to dip. All parts are properly jigged. Activator gun is at proper air pressure and set. Activator gun has enough of the proper activator, because that's another thing that sucks is you get halfway through an activation and you run out of activator. So you have enough activator in there. Activator gun does not leak. Knife is on cutting table, so you have that knife ready. Film grabbers that are going to hold your film are on the table as well. A clean dry rag is available. Clean pair of gloves on hand, and all parts safe distance from activator missed. Dipping checklist. So this is the checklist I use to actually go into the dipping process. Shut off tank, circulation motor. Install left dam, which is going to be the dam closest to your filtration side depending on how you have your tank oriented. But usually it's going to be where the filtration is going. So the left dam is installed as soon as you shut off your tank. Unroll film and cut to fit part size. While you're doing this, the water is starting to settle and you're starting to get no movement in the water. Roll up the film and move to the right side of the table. And of course, reinstall the film back into the plastic tubing it came in. Install the film grabbers onto the film. Water in the tank has settled and no movement is present. So you might still have to wait, just depends. Lay film on the water, start the timer set for 60 seconds. Position right dam next to the film edge and close gap with center dam. So you're putting that other dam in and then you're bringing your center slider into you if you have one in your tank. You may not have one in your tank. You might have to just adjust each dam this way. Now that you have about 20 seconds left on your timer, the activator gun is now in your hand, ready to roll. Timer sounds. Go ahead and press the buzzer or whatever. Go ahead and reset the timer and turn it off. Spray the activator using the following patterns. And I want you to pay attention to these patterns. So this is based on my tank. It's 1 meter wide, however many feet long of film that you're using in there. So if you're using a 1 meter wide size film, you need to make the passes with 50% overlaps, and it's going to take 8 passes at about 8 to 10 inches above the water. And you're going to go in clean flowing motions, never stopping the flow with 50% overlaps all the way through till you get to the end. If you're using NJM 2010 activator, you're going to have to use one slow pass followed by one fast pass in the same fashion. If you're using 3502 activator from TWN, you're going to only do one fast pass. It's a little bit more aggressive. Activator passes for a 50 centimeter film width, which is half of the meter. 4 passes with 50% overlap in the same fashion. You might have to adjust depending on the activator you're using, the tank you're using, or your equipment, or your conditions inside the shop. Either way, this is going to be about the magic point to get the right activation. Your spray gun is going to also matter, and it might determine how this works. But on average, this is what you're going to need with the equipment that I have set up. So if you have a smaller tank and it's only 50 centimeters, well, do it like this. Only do the 4 passes. You might have to only go to 3 passes. It just depends on your situation. And we'll talk about that in a minute with the string test. Again, here I'm bringing up the proper motion to use the spray gun in and not to have that stiff wrist, to have that loose wrist so it stays completely even from the water. Instead of 6 to 8 inches, we'll call it 8 to 10 inches. But honestly, this is what your spraying should look like with 50% overlaps. It also, just as a note, when you're dialing in your spray gun for activator, you use a piece of paper on the wall. You can use acetone, you can use xylol, you can use denatured alcohol, or you could also use activator, but do the same thing. Check your patterns and make sure you're getting complete atomization with your activator gun as well. And check it frequently. If you have to, check it at the beginning of the morning to make sure everything's spraying right. You might need to clean your gun or whatever.